All right. Welcome to the annual Norse Institute Roundtable. So this is an in conjunction with meeting. It's not a formal AES meeting. I will give you the agenda in a second. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to give a short welcome and update from our biorepositories. Then we're going to have a discussion about definitions and whether to modify, clarify, expand. We're almost certainly going to do some of that. That'll be about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have a talk about outcome measures that Krista Eschbach's going to lead. And then we left 20 minutes at the end for people to just interact, collaborate, meet people. And without further ado, let's get started because we're a little late. So first, some big thank yous. Biggest thank you is to Nora Wong, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but she is on Zoom. Oh, you can see her down there. Wave, Nora. So Nora's been our inspiration and leading force since the beginning. She's the executive director of the Norse Institute. And I think everyone here has probably interacted with her or knows her in some way. But thank you, Nora, for keeping us going, keeping us motivated. And thank you to you and Raymond for all the support in many ways, including financially. Big thank you to UCB. Who's here from UCB? We have two people. So UCB has helped sponsor this year. So we greatly appreciate that because we need support to keep doing things like this. Thank you to Cure for a couple of things. Number one, for helping to support today, especially when they heard that Nora couldn't come, they jumped in and have been great help. So I think Madeline and Alicia are the ones helping us. They are also the fiscal sponsor for the Norse Institute, which enables us to do things like accept help from UCB. And thanks to the AES for allowing us to do this year after year in conjunction with so far. It is an application process every year, but so far we've always been accepted. And then for organizing today, I want to thank Dr. Margaret Gopal. Wave, Maggie. She's, I think all of you probably communicated with her at some point too, but she's at Yale with me and runs our Norse research program basically, but also helped organize and set up today's meeting. Okay. So for those of you that don't know, we have a nice Norse Institute website. There's extensive resources there for clinicians and families. We have a medical advisory board as well. Some of the resources offered are listed here. We do offer kind of these informal email discussions and real-time input to difficult cases around the world. Hopefully most of you have seen that at some point. And then there's more formal monthly case conference that have been started between the Baylor group and the UK. It's basically a 1-hour session going over a couple of cases in depth. There's the patient and family support meetings. There's the family registry. So that's for patients or families to enroll their own themselves or their family member into this database. And that's led to a couple of publications as well. That one's mostly looking at long-term outcomes in a variety of ways. And Tennille Gofton from Ontario runs that. We have two major studies going on. One is the multi-center study supported by the Critical Care EEG Monitoring Research Consortium. So that one is 25 centers who have their own IRB and very detailed information enroll. And we have over 80 patients over several years in that. It's still going. Who knows when if we keep getting funding, we'll keep it going forever. And then there's the newer open Norse Fires Biorepository that is stored at Yale. But for that one, we can take patients from anywhere in the world and you do not need IRB at your own center. We can send the patients or families directly. We just need help from the people at the local center for getting us the clinical information and helping with the communication with the families. But the consent is directly with Yale. So far we've enrolled 42 cases from 9 countries through there. We have more than 120 cases in the repository, and Okari Hanen has been instrumental in keeping all that up over the years. So she's in Paris now, but still works with us. So she really runs that and helps make sure we get all the information we need for it. We also offer, so this is a biobank, so we offer the samples and the clinical data to investigators who want them. There's a simple application process, and we have quarterly steering committee meetings to review them. So I do want to encourage anyone who's doing research on this to use our samples or our data. So just let us know. Our email is norse@yale.edu. I also want to mention two other things. So one, we recently submitted a grant to PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, for a $15 million grant to do an anakinra versus tocilizumab trial. We actually have the opportunity to add 3 or 4 more centers. So if somebody's interested, please let us know. We will hear in somewhere around April on whether we're getting funding, but we made it through all the initial hurdles and reviews. The other point I want to make is we not only enroll Norse patients, acute Norse patients, but we now also will enroll people who are in the chronic phase. We'll talk about what to call that. We also want control, so patients with refractory status epilepticus who have a known cause, some other etiology, acute hemorrhage or stroke or chronic epilepsy as control groups. And we're also looking for autoimmune encephalitis without status as another form of control group. And you send us these patients, we'll get you cytokine results within a few business days. And that's the only thing you'll get acutely to help you with that current patient. The rest is purely research. These are the things we do with every sample we get. So autoantibodies, whole genome sequencing, the cytokines, autoantibodies, CSF metagenomics, transcriptomics. And if you give us tissue, we'll do a standard analysis in our neuropath lab. And then for the rest, we just store samples. And we do get long-term outcomes in a variety of manners on these patients for years. Just to give you an idea of what we have. So these are the number of patients we have for acute specimens. So you see the first column is how many we received, and then the second is how many we still have some fluid left, some samples left for researchers. So we still have tons, including some autopsies and biopsies. And this is now relatively new where we started to store the chronic phase. So we have 23 patients. We've gotten samples in the late phase, mostly with epilepsy, almost all, and 6 of them with recurring status epilepticus. And here's just a listing of the projects that we've supported, mostly by providing biosamples, some of them just by providing data. So you can see it's really all around the world and runs the gamut from basic science to epidemiology type studies. Okay. Any questions or comments or anything I forgot to mention? Maggie, Nora, O'Reilly, any other important announcements? Okay. Okay. So recently I sent around a few questions that we might want to discuss here about clarifications or modifications or expansions to the definitions of Norse and fires. And I received 32,000 responses, some of them several pages long. So I spent the last week reading them all, but I will certainly not be able to comment on everybody's comments. But thank you to everybody who responded. It's quite interesting and quite variable responses. So I've picked 3 or 4 things that I would like to try and talk about, discuss a little bit today. And I put some times next to how long we can spend on them. So I have 3 slides on the prior definitions just so everyone's on the same page. And I highlighted in yellow the things that we might want to discuss to clarify. Not all of it now, but these are the things that I think are open to clarification or modification. So Norse is a clinical presentation, not a specific diagnosis. That is not something that we're looking to rediscuss. It's a clinical presentation, just like status epilepticus or refractory status epilepticus. Norse is just another type of status epilepticus. Then it adds without epilepsy or other pre-existing relevant neurologic disorder. That needs clarification. And without a clear acute or active structural, toxic, or metabolic cause. That probably needs a little. And this is directly from the paper, it says allows remote brain injuries or resolved epilepsy. So what exactly is allowed, what remote means is still open for discussion. It's typically presents as super refractory, but that's not required, just refractory. And if you never find an etiology, it's called cryptogenic Norse, and that's the one everyone's interested in studying. Okay, and then the last slide on the prior definitions is fires is a subcategory of Norse that requires a prior febrile infection with fever starting between 2 weeks and 24 hours prior to refractory status. It has to be refractory status. We'll talk a little bit about that. What do you do with cases that aren't just explosive onset of epilepsy or status that was controlled? Is that really different, or does it warrant study? And then excluding most cases of prolonged febrile convulsions. So yes, it does exclude it from fires, but we accidentally forgot to exclude it from Norse, as the Claudine Scollier and Toby Lodenkemper published. Technically, the atypical febrile status doesn't qualify as fires, but still qualifies as Norse, which was an accident. So we need to specifically exclude febrile status. Okay, so going to the specific questions, and this is where everyone has to help discuss it. So we have about at least 10 minutes. We can talk about the clarifications to this related to comorbidities, basically pre-existing neurologic disorder. Should we, a couple suggestions were add the word active to it and give examples like someone who has a progressive tumor or a neurodegenerative condition. Those certainly ones we want to exclude from Norse. I'd love to get people's feeling about intellectual disability and developmental delay. If you have that pre-existing, does that prevent you from having Norse? We had no agreement at all on that one, I don't think. And then there was one suggestion to just delete the phrase completely because it already says you can't have an active structural, toxic, or metabolic cause. And then I'll just put up the other 2 points and we can discuss all of them together. So remote injury is in there as something that is permitted, but what does remote mean? If you had a traumatic brain injury 3 years ago, is that okay? I mean, most people don't present with refractory status when they're a year or two out from an acute brain injury, but should we include them in Norse or not? And then the other one we've learned in our trials is we need to exclude people who are like hospitalized with multiple medical things going on. Even if there's not a clear explanation for their seizures at that moment, we have excluded those from all of our Norse studies. Press, we wanted to specifically exclude. We've said any acute and active serious medical condition, we've excluded from our studies. If you have a acute organ failure, again, this has to be before they went into status. If it's from the treatment or something else, yeah, they can still be included. But if they had acute renal failure first and then started seizing, I don't think that's what we're looking for Norse. And then can't really see what it says there. It says something about should we have something that says they're in their usual chronic state of health without any acute medical problem. And then specific questions are what about people with HIV or chronic renal failure? Is that still okay to have for Norse? So I'm going to just stop there, open it up, see what people say about all these things. So pre-existing disorders, specifically the intellectual disability question, and then other active medical issues. And we can take comments from the room. We have a couple microphones and the people on Zoom, and I believe the people on Zoom will be able to hear the microphones. It worked at least half an hour ago. Okay, who wants to start? Check the chat. Oh, can't get my mouse. Okay. Everyone can see the chat comments, just to warn you. I'm putting them up on the board. So if you want to send chat questions or comments, you can, but also happy to have you people on Zoom just speak. Who wants to comment? Go ahead over here. Oh, and please tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Marian Galovich from Zurich in Switzerland. I'm a bit skeptical about number 2. So if you have a remote brain injury, like a remote stroke or TBI. Norse could be the first manifestation of structural epilepsy. And I'm not sure about this. I'm not quite sure whether I really want to include these cases. I mean, it's pretty rare to manifest for the first time with status epilepticus, but I'm not quite sure whether the mechanisms and what we're looking at in those typical Norse cases, which we think are mostly driven by immunological factors, are the same if somebody has a first manifestation of structural epilepsy.
Yeah, I think you can make the exact same argument for the intellectual disability as well. I'm not sure what to do about it, whether to include it or to include it with some sort of modifier.
Yeah, Eugen Trinker, Salzburg, Austria. I think the major distinction is cryptogenic Norse versus all the other Norse cases. We are concerned about the cryptogenic Norse where we don't find the things which we find in other Norse cases. So to exclude certain other causes from the other Norse cases doesn't help in any way to find solutions for the cryptogenic Norse. So I think when we talk about the definition, we should strictly distinguish those two forms. And that was the major achievement, to my opinion, that you have a label as a clinical presentation, then you find something, and then it's no longer cryptogenic. And it can be, as you said, Marianne, it can be a remote trauma. It can be a stroke, etc. But it's still new onset refractory status epilepticus. So I think all the comments which I read, very sensible, but they did not distinguish quite clearly from the cryptogenic versus the non-cryptogenic. And that's important when we talk about this.
Okay, but with the cryptogenic versus not, we're usually talking about the acute etiology. But what if, well, let's even something like an in utero stroke, and then at age 7, they have refractory status. Is that still Norse or no?
Well, that's a matter of definition. We can agree to everything as long as we all accept this definition, but it doesn't make any sense. And it's also, if you say where we have the categories of the causation, acute symptomatic, remote symptomatic, progressive symptomatic, and then we only look at the acute symptomatic and not at the remote symptomatic. But it's still, the presentation is Norse. The cause is something else. It can be acute, it can be remote, it can be progressive.
Okay, there you go.
It cannot be within electroclinical syndromes because that's per definition excluded.
Gotcha. There's a comment from Susa about attribution. So yeah, you have to be able to attribute the status to the pre-existing condition. So that can be difficult, but sometimes it's easy. If their status is clearly coming from a totally different location than their remote injury, you're much more likely to just include that. But Jim, yeah. Oh, hang on for the microphone so Zoom can hear you. You can hear, right? Nora, can you hear? Thank you. Oh, okay, Gerhard next.
If we think about the status classifications, though, we should also have the acute precipitant, because that patient that's the 7-year-old who had a chronic or an old intrauterine stroke, what if there's an acute precipitant? So I think that would take it, that might take it out of the pure cryptogenic Norse, but the acute onset could be related to something different. Like,
Yeah.
and if we think about fever triggered or infection related or influenza or any of those kind of disorders, I think they may have some of the same mechanisms that we would be talking about, independent of whether they had an old stroke.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been just including those cases so far with a mention that there's a contributing factor.
So by contributing factor, though, you mean the contributing factor of the remote insult versus
the remote
acute
one.
Precipitant.
The remote one.
Yeah.
Well, for research purposes, all the gray ones we're just excluding. We don't count as a case or a control, and we're not sure which one to put them in, but that's for research. Gerhard?
Regarding fires, I would include the status has to be super refractory, and I would like to highlight, this is very important to me, no development delay. Development delay is an exclusion criteria for me for fires.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure we're gonna get a complete agreement on. Let me just get a quick feeling of the crowd. How many people think if you have developmental delay, you should be excluded from the Norse and fires term?
Excluded from Norse or still, or excluded
Well-
from fires, but still possible in Norse.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just say Norse to start. Should you be excluded from Norse if you have developmental delay? These are the yes people. How many think you should be excluded? Wait, and how many people think you should still be allowed to have Norse even if you had significant developmental delay? Oh, so that one's about 95% of people. And how about fires? How many people think you can have developmental delay and have fires? Still most people. Okay, and then you had a comment? Oh, couple. Okay, there's one on the other side of you too.
So the problem with Rana Saeed, UT Southwestern Dallas Pediatric Epilepsy, the concern about developmental delay, it's such a broad statement. And as pediatric doctors, I mean, like, is that like a little language delay? Can't they walk? So it's just such a broad spectrum that I think it's really hard to say the kid who's a little late in walking and then develops Norse, you know, so that's the huge caveat asterisk.
Yep,
of it.
absolutely.
I think if you have a child with developmental delay, and
Can you
then
just tell us your name, please?
I'm Brua Benzi from Sheba Medical Center, Israel, pediatric neurologist, I said. And I think in a child with developmental delay, because of the possibility of finding hiding causes for his delay, which can maybe contribute to the evolution of fires or Norse, I think they should be included, but genetic studies has to be reevaluated or done while the child is having the attack. And then if we find something, depending on what we find, we have to decide if we include it or exclude it, because maybe it will contribute to our understanding of the Norse mechanisms and fires mechanisms by finding a group of patients, which Gerard is probably referring to, as having a clinical picture which is common to all of them, which is like fires-like kind of, and they all carry the same gene mutation. So I think it's important to include them,
Gotcha.
but further investigating.
Yeah, that's been my general principle is for now be very more inclusive, study them all, figure things out, and you can always, based on actual data, change things later. Let's take the two more comments that we're waiting, and then I think we'll move to the next topic.
I think I agree. I'm Danielle DeCampo from CHOP. I think I agree that it is nice to include all of the patients when we're starting to think about, I think in pediatrics, as has kind of been alluded to, I think it becomes very challenging when we're talking about intellectual delay and autism. And I think if we do intellectual delay, then we have to do autism. I think, you know, the diagnosis in of itself becomes very challenging in that population. There's lots of people who don't even get the diagnosis of ID who get the diagnosis of autism. So I think autism would have to be included. And I think it's going to be really, I think the fact that these kids already have a predisposition to epilepsy, right? So 46%, 30 to 46% higher risk of developing epilepsy puts them in a different classification altogether. And maybe we include them, but we include them as a separate subcategory. And I think a couple things that I had raised was my concern is when we're looking at biomarkers or when we're discussing about attributes of Norse and fires is if somebody has autism and then they present in Norse and then we find that they have dysgenesis of the corpus callosum, are we still going to call this Norse? When we're looking at biomarkers of EEG marking, are we going to say that their slowing is, we know they're going to have some slowing. So then is that going to kind of muddy, I guess, the waters in terms of biomarkers for Norse or fires? So I'm not saying to exclude it, but I do think that they should be very carefully subdivided. And I think that can become increasingly challenging because the diagnosis of autism and intellectual disability in children is varied. So I think that's what
Gotcha.
makes it it's not just one type of ID, right? It's an active problem for us, right? We don't consider this to be a chronic. It's chronic, but it's active in that these children are ongoing with development. They're not.
Okay,
they're still
thanks.
not
Let's go.
behaving
Let's get
as
one
adaptive.
more. And we can differentiate how we're defining things for research versus clinical also. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
that was just the point I was also going to make. I'm Rachel from Lurie Children's in Chicago, that having intellectual disability and developmental delay, the caveat is also just the age of the patient that you're seeing when potentially Norse or Fires presents itself, and what is that risk based on the age dependency that is likely the first presentation of epilepsy for that child. And I think it's really important, and this is a challenging category, even if we do have a subcategory from a research perspective, it would be really hard to analyze this population and include them potentially in Norse or Fires.
Okay, Nora, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, I'm concerned about excluding people with developmental delay because it creates a boundary on the lower end, a lower end of that spectrum. And in the Norse family conversations that I've had, I have not heard about developmental delay. On the contrary, I've heard of many cases of patients who are extremely, on the other end, either having extraordinary memory and intellectual capabilities. And so some of them might be considered Asperger's. Maybe they have or have not been diagnosed, but most likely their families have not indicated that there's anything unusual about them. They just assume that their intellectual and memory abilities are just what made them special. And so you might be excluding some people on one end of the mental capacity, and then including people without knowing, because the families are not indicating their intellectual abilities that are unusual in their own ways. So again, I think that you would need to be very careful on who you're excluding and inadvertently including.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Nora. We're going to move on. I think we were over our 10 to 12 minutes. If I can get it to move. There we go. Okay. There's another controversial one. Maybe more controversial. I guess I'll make the point. So the term Norse, new onset refractory status epilepticus, that pretty much, it's a clinical presentation. So that could only be used acutely. It doesn't make sense to say you have chronic new onset refractory status. It just doesn't make sense. If you have epilepsy later, most people are calling that post-Norse epilepsy. Maybe that's easy. But whether there's a chronic inflammatory state, whether that exists, and what it should be called is worth discussing. Fires, on the other hand, is used both for the acute presentation and for the chronic epilepsy syndrome. So for that, people are commonly talking about the acute phase and the chronic phase, which makes much more sense than something that has epilepsy syndrome in the name. One could argue with the acute presentation, you don't really know it's fires yet. They have to have the epilepsy later, and true, the vast majority do have epilepsy later. So I think it's an issue, and this has been part of the problem with why people don't like putting fires under Norse, because they see it as a chronic epilepsy syndrome, not just an acute presentation. So what should we call it? There's been, I think post-fires, most people did not like in all the comments, including me. Should the acute phase, you could make the argument the acute phase is just called Norse with or without prior febrile illness. I think Zubeda Sheikh was like this, the plus F or minus F in her comments. And then the chronic epilepsy part is, the chronic thing is the fires. If you have epilepsy after, then that becomes fires. Carle, if you are going to have acute and chronic, what time does that switch, and should it be based on what? I think one of the more commonly accepted suggestions was after the end of status epilepticus, there should be some time period, and after that it becomes chronic, maybe a month. And then someone brought up, can you have chronic fires or whatever we call it if you have no epilepsy, just from the cognitive and behavioral effects. And this relates to the what's called ITES, infection-triggered encephalopathy syndrome. They don't all have seizures, but it's a very similar pathophysiology, probably. And then one was, when is epilepsy diagnosed? To me, that one's easy. If you have any unprovoked late seizure, it's epilepsy. Even if it's from withdrawing a medication, that means you have epilepsy. It was just controlled with the medication. But you need to have at least one seizure. Just because people put medicines on you doesn't give you epilepsy. You have to have at least one seizure late, in my mind. So that's all for this section. I did want to give you a little bit of our latest data on later epilepsy. I don't know what that bullet says. Must not be important. Okay. So this is, Aurélie put this together from our very latest, Anthony Jimenez, and published a paper with our data. But this is the latest data on who has epilepsy with it. And we stuck to people who had at least 12 months of outcome. And if you had any late seizure, we counted that as epilepsy. But if you never had a seizure, we did not. And yes, they are all on anti-seizure medication still, or virtually all. So overall, in the FIRES patients of all ages, 77% had epilepsy later, and that was 82% of adults and 68% of pediatrics. I know you're very surprised by that 68%. And in the non-FIRES patients, it was about half. And there's virtually no pediatric ones there. There's only 3 of them, so that's not useful. But if you look in the table, so we divided also into the all patients, the cryptogenic in the middle and non-cryptogenic on the right. And I will point out, look at pediatric FIRES. There were 19 patients with acute pediatric FIRES. 6 of them went 1 year without having any seizures after. I know most epileptologists don't think that happens, but in our data, it's happening when you follow them prospectively. I don't know how much of it is that people just don't come to epileptologists after if they have no seizures, or I don't know what, or we're actually getting milder cases. Even in the cryptogenic, it was 5 out of 18 with cryptogenic FIRES, pediatric, who did not have any seizures by a year from our data. So that's one of the surprising data points here. Okay, I guess I'll leave this up. So maybe I'll put the prior slide up for discussion topics. Okay. So let's maybe hear some suggestions on what to do about acute versus chronic, when it changes, what to call it. Those are the main things. What should we do about acute and chronic? Professor Trinka.
Yeah, thank you. So I think if we keep it simple, Norse is status epilepticus, and I think we can all agree on that. And status epilepticus is an acute condition. It can be repeated status, but it's overall it's an acute condition. And the acute condition can have etiological categories where we say it's acute, remote, or progressive. In analogy, we can say it's acute symptomatic Norse due to whatever, or it's remote symptomatic Norse due to whatever. And we can say FIRES is listed in the epilepsy syndrome paper. It's very clearly described. So it's in the onset of this epilepsy syndrome is a status epilepticus. So it has an acute onset, and then it has a chronic phase. And when the transition point is something which we can define. I mean, this is something which all diseases have, which leave the patients with a chronic disability. For instance, a stroke, yeah, you have a chronic disability afterwards. And the status epilepticus, you may have post-status epilepticus epilepsy based on different etiologies. So I think if we keep to this framework, we take a lot of confusion out of that and say that FIRES is an epilepsy syndrome, which presents as Norse. I mean, there's when you think about Dravet syndrome, and they also present with status epilepticus at the beginning. So it's a new onset refractory status.
So a corollary question to that. Okay, so what if you have acute FIRES and never develop epilepsy? Is that still FIRES?
Well, FIRES is defined as You say it still fires? No, it's not fired. It's not fired.
But you called it fires acutely.
No,
You
you
did-
think
That's
it's
why, but
fired,
you already called it fires acutely because you didn't yet know whether they were going to have epilepsy.
No, then you may say maybe
It's
you're wrong.
acute
and
fires,
it's
but no
not-
chronic fires?
It's not fires. If
Okay,
you define
and then the-
fires as epilepsy.
The other
symptom,
question is, what if you have Norse, exact same thing with Norse, no prior fever, and you develop epilepsy later, the equivalent without the prior febrile illness? What are you calling that?
Call it
Just post-Norse
post-status
epilepsy?
epilepsy or post-Norse epilepsy.
Okay,
Andreas van Baalen, I created the term fires, and I have data over 120 children, and 2 children has no seizures due to anti-seizure medication. So I have a typical pattern of disease, and I think we have a subgroup of the cryptogenic pediatric fires, and I think it's a good idea to have modifiers, but to keep it easy for the clinicians like me.
And like me.
thank you. We have Nicola.
I guess while I'm walking over here, I would just add in, I think it's hard when they're still on anti-seizure medications. If they're seizure-free at a year, is that because they're still on anti-seizure medications? When you start tapering, will they have seizures and then they meet the epilepsy?
Sure.
Hi, Nicola Specchio. Going back on the acute and chronic, I agree with Eugen. We have clear-cut differences in the two periods of life that patient. So we do have the encephalopathy at the beginning. We have a specific EEG findings in the acute phase, which is disappearing during the chronic. I mean, the slow waves, they're slowly disappearing. And in the chronic phase, you don't have slow waves. You may have fast activity differently. And type of seizures, they can be a little bit different in the acute and chronic phase, very repetitive in the acute and uncountable also in the acute phase. And differently in the chronic, you have more focal to bilateral rather than very focal in the ICU with just twitching and movements of the face. So I think we have to keep the two different phases for treatment purposes and for classification purposes, and for also prognosis is important, having the two terms differently. When they switch after the encephalopathy. When the encephalopathy disappear, and that's the moment in which they go from acute to chronic. I don't think it's really the ICU admission.
Okay.
It's
Yeah, I think everyone agreed not to go by ICU or hospital
yeah,
discharge.
stomach
Yeah.
growth in the
Yeah, I think I did.
ICU.
That got shot down quickly, but let's do just one more on this topic. So we have Olga. I mean, I didn't intend to solve everything and have a final paper by the end of this 40 minutes. So
Hi,
this is great stuff, though.
I'm Olga Trashenko, University of Nebraska. So Larry, we're going back to the definitions and revamping the definitions. So fires is part of Norse, right? So we agree with that. Maybe we can do Norse plus F. I do believe that diagnosis of Norse should be staying with the patient just for the history's sake, that history of Norse, just like history of stroke, and then post-Norse epilepsy, we just have to define the time point when it becomes a post-Norse epilepsy. That's
Okay.
just my first.
Thank you. Yeah, I used to think of it as status epilepticus. Right? You say history of status epilepticus, it's still useful, even though it's not a specific disorder. Okay. Great stuff. I have one or two more things. Okay, atypical cases. So one, this is, what should we do about, so far we've excluded these. If you're not refractory status, but just status, or if you even never even reach status, just have explosive onset of seizures and post febrile infection and end up with epilepsy. One has to think is a very similar pathophysiology going on. Maybe it's the same thing. I know Andreas has a large series of this. And I think you guys actually have some slides to comment on this. If so, we can just have you guys share them. Hold on, let me see if there's, I think I had one other thing on this slide. Oh yeah, so just, I guess it was unclear to some people if it was okay to have isolated seizures before status. That's actually very common, of these crescendo seizures, and they ends up in status. That all usually happens in a few days. And we should define that and explicitly state that and maybe give a time period to it. In general, I've used 2 weeks. If it's been going on for more than 2 weeks, I'm not sure if that should be included or not. But I'd love some thoughts on that. And I think Gerhard or Andreas or someone, why don't we go to you guys first? And if you wanted to share some slides, you can. If not, just talking's fine too. I think somebody sent something today.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'll try and share the slide.
We can barely hear you. If you could, yeah, speak loudly.
You need to cancel sharing your slides and then I can try
Okay.
share.
1 second. Takes a while to get the mouse to show up. Is it allowing?
Yeah.
Thank you. Got it.
Okay, so I'll very, very briefly, I just wanted to share on behalf of my colleagues, together with Gerhard and Leon and Bruya, who spoke earlier. I'll skip this introduction because I think everyone here knows that there's very limited evidence of genetic causes of fires. There was a recent publication in epilepsy that I'm sure people are aware of. So we actually have a case series of patients with the NM1L variant who all had 10 patients who all had fires-like presentations, all presented in school age, mainly age 4 to 8. And interestingly, following on this discussion, half of them did have some mild or some slightly more moderate developmental delay. And all had a kind of fires-like story, except for a few of them had a biphasic picture where they had like 1 month of status epilepticus, then a break, and then they returned to more status epilepticus. And one of the patients actually recovered largely from the first bout, and then a few years later presented with a second bout. I will skip over the neuroimaging and the other clinical areas just for the sake of time. One interesting point to point out that one patient significantly deteriorated, crashed on a ketogenic diet, and out of this group of 10 patients, 2 died, 5 remained in a very poor state, and 3 with severe intellectual disability. I won't go into the variants, but there's a recurrent variant, which if anyone here in this group has patients of, I'd be interested to hear of, and a few compound heterozygotes also. There's also a wider clinical spectrum of this, of DMN1L, of course, which I won't go into now. So we actually have some interesting ongoing work with a few different groups around the world, trying to understand DMN1L and how it causes fires. I think we've already discussed many of these open questions. We thought calling them fires-like cases is probably the best, reflecting that some of them had prior developmental delay. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. So what we've done so far is if you knew about the mutation ahead of time, then we weren't calling it fires, but if you did not know, then we would say it was fires and you eventually found a genetic etiology, but we still count them on it. But maybe as we have more and more people with pre-existing genetic diagnoses, we shouldn't do that. Maybe they should all just be fires due to or related to the genetic mutation. Thank you. And Nicholas put in a comment about the patients that present as status and not refractory status. There are papers already about, people call that Norse without the R. But then what if it's not status at all? It's just NOE, new onset epilepsy? No, that's not right. New onset explosive epilepsy? NOEE? New onset of, can we call it paroxysmal epilepsy? Then it'd be nope. Nope. All right, other thoughts about the acute and chronic and atypical and yeah, by the way, thank you for that 3-minute presentation of a whole topic. That was great. Perfect. Yes, please. They won't hear you on Zoom, other.
That's very interesting, this series of 3 cases. Sorry? 10 cases, yes, sorry. I was wondering, in DNM1L, you have typically several lesions in the brain, acute lesion in the ICU. So which makes a difference between what we are used to see in fires. And so I wanted to comment, I wanted to give a, yeah. You have some kind of like vascular distribution? No?
Nothing.
Nothing.
The child that we got into the series was slightly delayed, and it was taken from the history after she broke out with fires-like picture at 6 years of age. She had some speech problems, but she was going to a regular school, regular kindergarten, and she was not really different from other peers. And she had 6 weeks of what I called fires at that point. No normal MRI, normal metabolic workup. Everything was, she came out of the fires with the usual treatments, including ketogenic diet actually. And a month later, while she was recovering and having less seizures and being in a rehab unit, she broke up into another flare of 2 months of status epilepticus required given convulsive shock. And then she remained like post-fires, as you like to say, with recurrent seizures, being quite disabled, but she had almost 4 months of status. So there are some fires without, and the genetic workup was done actually 6 or 7 years after, because at the time she had the attacks, we didn't do exome sequencing. So it was done 6 years after, and we found the mutation. And then we found the other cases and contacted all the rest of the group, and we found similar stories. So no, there were some MRI changes in part of the patient. Some of them had normal MRI, and you couldn't, unless you checked it, you couldn't know that it's not fires.
Great, thanks. I'm going to cut off that one now. I have two minutes left for everything else. I'll just mention some other things we might be addressing. And there's a bunch of good comments have come through too. Zubeda, the only problem with new onset acute repetitive seizures, that would be pronounced Norse. That would be way too complicated. Norse. Okay, so the other thing, we are going to make it clear that febrile status is excluded. We don't have time to go over it, but we'll come up with the problem with the definition of febrile status as it stands now, no one's ever included a time of fever, like whether you could have had fever for 2 days and still count it. That's certainly atypical, but that's not in any of the definitions. And most people think 24 hours is a decent cutoff, although I asked Shlomo Shanar that yesterday. He thought some people have fever for longer than that, and he still calls it febrile status. So we'll have to deal with that. The only other question was whether that came up that will be a little bit difficult is if we should use a lower age cutoff. Some people think age 2 should be the cutoff. Anything below that, we shouldn't be calling Norse or fires. It's something different. I don't know. I think for now we should include them and determine that with data. So those are just some other things we will be addressing in the near future. So that will be it for my part on the definitions and the classification. So thank you for the fantastic comments and discussion. And we're going to move on to, and get more food and drink. Okay, so Krista is gonna now run the part on outcomes. Dr. Eschbach, it's all yours. Do you want all these things showing?
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
The
You guys will
chat.
let me know too.
Here's your chat, there's your people. And the mouse, you have to like do this for a while for it to show up sometimes.
Okay. Okay.
Just use the arrows.
All right. So yeah, thank you for coming today. So my name's Krista Eschbach. I'm a pediatric epileptologist in Colorado, and lead the Norse Long-Term Outcomes Working Group. And so something that we talked about last year at the roundtable, we had a subgroup that talked about outcomes. We did a prioritization of outcomes at that time. And now we're hoping to kind of start some discussions about next steps of actually how we should measure outcomes after Norse. And so I just wanted to review, I sent out, you guys hopefully all got some preliminary information that I sent out, but I also wanted to review a little bit of what we have to help guide some different outcomes in patients with Norse as a start, although the slides aren't advancing, so let me, and then they advance. There we go. Okay. So some of the things that will start the discussion for today, similar to, as Larry mentioned, we aren't going to be able to have consensus and fully move forward with all of these today, but thinking about core sets of outcomes for clinical care in Norse related to research, and then also when outcome measures should be collected, both clinically and for research. So I just want to highlight this publications that came out earlier this year, which was a development of a standardized set of outcomes for both adult and pediatric epilepsy by James Mitchell. And here's a figure of kind of the different domains that they wanted to cover. Sorry, let me move the chat because you guys can't really, like, the mouse has disappeared a little bit. There we go. So here's some of the different domains that are emphasized as part of this outcome set. And then the next slide will talk specifically about those. I will say many of these domains are actually similar to when we did the prioritization last year about outcome measures and domains that we also felt like were important to address in patients with Norse and fires. There we go. So what they did for this is, I think I just have to get rid of the chat altogether. This is not going to work. So in terms of some of the domains, they then broke them down. So they do address survival, thinking about all-cause mortality, as well as epilepsy-specific mortality, thinking about SUDEP. I didn't copy it onto here, but when they're talking about epilepsy control and disease progression, they have very specific ways of measuring that and how that should be determined in terms of seizure frequency, seizure freedom, if there's emergence of a new seizure type, and then seizure severity. And then saying that the Liverpool seizure severity scale is optional as well. For adults, they talk about the importance of assessing cognition, so memory and attention with PROMIS measures, and then the QALY-10. And then also health-related quality of life with the QALY-10, psychological outcomes, including depression, anxiety, and suicidality with the measures listed there, so the PHQ-9 and the GAD-2, sleep adequacy with the PROMIS sleep disturbance form, and then also determining emergency and unplanned healthcare services. There's sex questions on women's reproductive health for women of childbearing age, and then also looking at complications of treatment. And then they also provide some recommendations for clinical and demographic measures that should be part of this assessment as well. And I should mention their focus too was looking at clinically what we should be looking at, which may, as we can discuss between clinical and research, what those should look like. Oops. I don't know. Here we go. There we go. For pediatrics, it's slightly more complicated, related to the different ages of patients and their ability to complete different measures. There's still the domains of survival, epilepsy control, cognition, and then the health-related quality of life. There's different measures depending on if the patient's able to complete it or a parent, so depending on their age. And then same with for the psychological outcomes. So the measurement that they would recommend being used varies depending on the patient age and their ability to complete the measures, as well for sleep.
And then also they added neurodevelopmental domains as well, highlighting the importance of looking at motor, cognitive, and behavioral outcomes. They mentioned using the MCHAT as a screener between 16 and 48 months. So that's looking for autism screening. But then the other ones, it's really just documenting if they have delays is the recommendations as part of this. And then complications of treatment as well, and some clinical and demographic variables. The other data that I just wanted people to be aware of as we're discussing this is there is recommended outcome measures for critical care, and that these were published a couple of years ago. And so as we are thinking about Norse and what outcomes we should be considering, I think it's important to know what's there and try and make sure that we're aligning when possible with different outcomes that are already there. So this is what has been proposed for pediatric critical care. There's a core outcome measure set that you can see there under the general category, covering several of the domains that we had decided last year were also important for patients with Norse and fires, and then also some additional measures that can be used depending on the circumstance. And then lastly, I think the other important thing as we're talking about this is that there will be ILE common data elements for status. Hiba's here, she can certainly chime in more about it, but that will be moving forward. So again, as we're thinking about outcomes related to Norse and fires, want to be mindful of other efforts from a clinical standpoint too, to develop common data elements to make sure that things are aligned. All right. So then this is, I just wanted, and this is what I emailed out so people can have a framework for kind of starting the discussion for today. So when we put together the PCORI grant that Larry mentioned, these were our primary and secondary outcome measures. So with PCORI, it's a patient-centered outcomes research institute. And so we involved and had formed a Norse patient family advisory board that also gave some input into these, although, there is many of them. And I will say some of our patient family advisory board members are actually on Zoom today as well. And so thank you to them for joining. But these are the primary and secondary outcome measures that we had. So we had a focus for the primary outcome on functional outcome with the Glasgow outcome scale extended, calculating it at 12 months, which I think we'll actually have to decrease that in terms of when it's going to be measured. So it may be at 6 months instead now. And then secondary outcomes looking at when status resolves, hospital length of stay, mortality, adverse events, the development of epilepsy, and then treatment success, which is defined. Oh, you guys can't see fully how it's defined because of the. Oh, they can on Zoom? Well, but people here in the room probably want to see too, yeah. Lack of need for another immunomodulator after the study drug was begun, plus good outcome at 1 year or at that primary outcome time point. And then here is the exploratory outcome. So this is the hard thing. There's so many outcomes that are important. And especially talking with patients and families, sometimes seizures are not necessarily the most important outcome kind of long-term, and there's other things that have a really significant impact. And so we wanted to include some patient and caregiver reported outcome measures. We included the clinical assessment scale and encephalitis as well. Days alive and at home by day 90, and then had also talked about doing, at least for this study, doing some qualitative work as well, and then also doing a symptom checklist because so many patients may struggle with other symptoms that we've heard about, such as weight loss, GI concerns, vision changes, endocrine and bone health concerns, and some of the other ones listed there. And lastly, before we start the discussion, so here is the list of patient and caregiver reported outcomes that we included. And so a lot of these are the neuro quality of life measures, which are part of the Biorepository already. And then some additional measures as well, looking at caregiver quality of life, and then how we would measure epilepsy severity. And I'm going to leave, so I was going to move on to discussion. I can go back to any of the previous slides if people want to see them. But I think some of the, initial discussion points that we were hoping to cover is kind of people's thoughts on clinical and research outcome sets. And we likely need, 2 different ones. Everything I listed would be not possible to collect on a clinical basis and have our patients do that, but I think can be important for research. So what are kind of the minimum outcomes that we need to make sure we're collecting? And then also, I guess we can start with that if people have thoughts about collecting clinical outcomes versus research and how that should look, or any of the measures for clinical versus research. If I can go back oops. Yeah. Well, I lost the mouse, but there we go. All right. So who wants to start? We have one person online, just while we're getting back to Olga, who suggested adding a measure used in value and impact, so the EQ5D. I think you have to push it up. It's hard to, yeah, so it's on.
Now it's on.
Yeah.
Okay, so Krista, I think once you start dividing clinical and research, people will think that the research is something that is not necessary and does not require high quality data collection approach, and becomes sort of at will, and you're gonna drop that a lot of times with many investigators. I think it has to be a common data set, maybe reduced, but practical, so people can do it at the clinical visits.
So you're proposing, it sounds like, yes, having one approach, and then there may be, you know, a little bit of variability, but not having kind of completely different. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Hiba Haider, University of Chicago. I can just chime in and speak to the plan for clinical common data elements. And I think your point is well taken, Olga, and the plan for the clinical common data element set, which I think a lot of this will overlap with, is to have a tier, 2 or 3 possible different tiers. One would be a very basic kind of core set of elements that we all agree on is the bare minimum that's necessary. And then there could be more tiers of exploratory elements that are either not validated or, are still in the research realm. But yeah, I agree. I think for clinical data collection, we want to keep it as simple as possible. We learned that through the implementation of other terminologies and nomenclatures, for sure.
What else? I think some of the hope with having this discussion is that there are kind of some different projects and people wanting to do research in this area. And so really wanting to synchronize how people are collecting data. So it's not that we have, all different outcome measures and different studies or different quality of life measures. And then it's, makes it more challenging to compare as well. And so that's part of the kind of reasons to try and sort this out a little bit more. I will also say, as I mentioned, we do have some patients and families on. No pressure. You guys don't have to unmute and say anything or put anything in the chat, but certainly if you want to share anything, feel free to add anything to the conversation.
And we tried to find a scale that would incorporate a little bit of everything: cognitive, behavioral, psychiatric, and epilepsy. And we had a lot of trouble. I think the case might be the only one that include a little bit of all of them, the encephalitis one. But in general, the seizure ones are completely separate from the other ones. So
yeah, so that's where you get that list of multiple different scales and measures that have to be collected.
you think we should be creating one that does incorporate all those? It is one scale. 'Cause the problem is, you end up with so many things.
I was gonna say that's what some other disease conditions have done, especially in pediatrics, is they've developed their own scales to monitor response.
We tried to resist that because there's so many scales already.
It's genius. I think we should include seizures at home at 90 days and get that cutoff for our future acute versus chronic breakdown.
Anyone on Zoom?
Nothing else yet.
I think the only problem I see with creating our own scale is if we have a very heterogeneous population with multiple etiologies, we're going to have a natural history that is going to be really varied. And so I think creating our own scale is going to be really challenging, at least at the beginning, until we've established the natural history of Norse, which is going to be defined by the population that we're including.
Yeah, I think
maybe
back there. Sorry, Larry, what were we going to say?
First of all, this is Danzo. I'm one of the new site PIs at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, I'll just keep it close. So on the topic of this, I also wanted to mention it's a little bit different, but we've created predictive calculators for many different things. You already have so many different clinical features, and this is like starting to like hit the idea of possible machine learning to possibly like predict certain kinds of outcomes like with these people. So I would imagine now with this data, could you create like an online calculator to think about like, well, is this someone you need to worry about having ongoing seizures, certain quality of life features, et cetera. So just wanted to add that.
Whoa, it's much louder. So you're a step ahead of us. You're not only trying to gather outcomes, but predict them.
Yeah.
So we're still trying to figure out what outcomes to gather before we're ready to predict them. But
Yeah, I think the other challenge that I've thought about and struggled with a lot is, again, across adult and pediatrics and across different functional abilities, how to have outcome measures, right? If you use lots of different scales, it makes it really hard and you're going to end up with really small groups that are able to complete each outcome scale. So I think that's also a challenge with as Daniel was saying, the heterogeneous population and variety of outcomes is how to address that.
I think it's important to have a basic and then a basic and extended version of testing, because in practical the basic testing is then we get more data from more patients, and we must think about the children who are mostly not able to make the whole testing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the one point. And the second point, I think also that 6 months after this status is the right time. And I think it's very interesting to see in several years again, to see the parents are asking how it will go on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I have no answer.
Yeah, I will say I should highlight. So for the PCORI grant, we did 6 months. Well, we did 12 months, but it'll go down to. Okay, so it'll still stay 12, and then ideally we'll continue to collect outcomes over time. It's just that from a grant purpose, we had to have a deadline. But I think acknowledging what you're saying, patients and families really want longer term outcomes. Even 2 years, things still change after that time for them, and so needing to really continue to follow whatever outcomes we select, like you're highlighting on, is really important.
Have you decided which one to use? You've showed many options there. If you haven't, I'm aware that the NIH toolbox is validated. And not only that, it will actually, they are coming up with baby NIH toolbox. I was told that will encompass the whole age group. So it's already validated, already well used. So maybe we have to start somewhere.
Right.
I will advocate for that
Yeah,
one.
yeah. We submitted with many of the neuro quality of life measures, as well as the PHQ-9. And I can see if I can share the slides again to show that. The neuro quality of life measures are validated in patients with epilepsy. Both adult and pediatrics were part of their validation cohort. I think some of the challenge with them, though, is that many of the patients that were part of the validation cohort, they didn't collect data about if they had a history of status. And so they haven't been, validated for use with status, but were validated for patients, both adult and pediatrics with epilepsy, and have T-scores for standard values. Yeah. But yes, it's hard. We looked at, like NIH Toolbox, the PROMIS measures, the NeuroQual measures. There's a lot to choose from.
Hi, Yi-Chen. I'm actually the non-neurologist in this group. So for me, in the ICU, things are much clearer, right? So sounds like what you need is something simple, and I advocate for GOS, right? It's intuitive. It's a quick, dirty. Anybody can learn it, right? And it doesn't take a lot of times. And from the family's perspective is quality of life indices, right? So in addition to how the sort of gross functional outcomes is the quality of life. And there are the challenges with the quality of life, the surveys is, nobody is going to fill out 30 pages. And unfortunately, a lot of those quality of life has too many domains. So I think what we probably need to do is see if we can find sort of quality of life surveys that is abbreviated to like 5 minutes or less. And at least that's a good starting point. And then we can sort of start adding stuff. Because like, for instance, some of the kids, and I'm sure the adults, it's becoming sort of standard practice where we would send them for formal, neurocognitive testing if they can, right? And so some of the kids will have that as part of their clinical pathway anyhow. So really just some gross neurologic outcomes that anybody can score in 5 minutes or less, and then some quality of life, surveys that the family can fill out in about 5 minutes or less.
Yeah. Yeah. So we did the QALY 10 and then also the PEDS QL epilepsy. And then for patients that are lower functioning, their ability to do those measures, there's actually the quality of life inventory disability that came out of Telethon Kids in Australia, which has been used for a lot of the developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. I know you also mentioned, neuropsych and other pieces too.
Can I ask you a question? In the, you've had several patient family advisory board meetings. Were any surprise requests from that on what you all decided you wanted to keep track of that's different than the standard things we already do?
Yeah, I think, and again, I guess I can't see I don't know if Maggie can see the chat. I can't see the chat right now. I think some of the things was really the importance of some of the other outcomes, the non-neurological outcomes. And so I think as part of the ICOM outcome measures that came out, they include a symptom checklist, and we added one. So the idea of evaluating, looking at vision, GI symptoms, endocrine and bone health were really important. And then also behavior and mental health, I think, are other pieces that have really come out. So again, some of not that seizures aren't important, but that these other things are really very important too.
I don't know if it was mentioned in the beginning, but I think in addition to the outcome measures, there is a need to get a very brief and retrospective data on the history of the patient before the onset of the FIRES or Norse, because maybe it affects outcome later, like behavioral issues, psychiatric issues, health issues, cognitive function in children, if they had some mild cognitive function. I'm not talking about, we're discussing developmental delays, including or excluding. And all these are important. And we have to, I think, to build a questionnaire, which will be concise about retrospective history in order to combine it, to analyze the outcome.
Yeah.
After the event.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I don't, it's something that I've thought about in terms of, is it feasible where if a patient comes in, a lot of the outcome measure scales talk about, the last 1 week or 2 weeks. Could you have families complete it, at that time? It wouldn't be the patient who's able to complete it, so it'd be a proxy. And would that give you, some sort of sense of their baseline previously, especially if we broaden, and include patients who have differing developmental abilities preceding Norse and fires? I think that'll be important. Yeah, good point. Let me see. I think there was a
One
few
other
things.
comment about the saying people get neuropsych or formal testing. Problem is everyone's using all different scales for that. So even when they get that, it's very hard to study it or compare people. So you have to standardize that as well, certainly in any research project. Any comments from Zoom land?
We did have some comments online. Sorry, this mouse is a little finicky. So Laura had mentioned, considering frequency of EEG monitoring, especially for resource limited countries, in terms of thinking about that from an outcome standpoint. I don't know if anyone has thoughts about what that should be. And then also considering, Susa had mentioned, could consider including an estimate of disease activity using a visual analog scale, which they have no measure, however, we act on assumed disease activity. And so that could be a good place to start. And then outcome is clearly dependent on the treatment, including over-treatment as well, from Gerard. Yeah. Which I think brings up the point, it's sometimes hard to tease out how much is from ongoing seizure activity, the initial status itself, versus, ongoing medications, polytherapy as well. Other thoughts? Nora, you put something in the chat. Do you want to unmute and say anything?
Well, just sort of repeating that I think that most families are obsessed with finding out why this happened to their children or their loved ones. And so I think they would be very interested in answering questions about their patients. And so that would align with natural history questions. But when families are asked to fill out forms that are in the format of scales, then I think that's a little bit different for some reason, because they're not familiar with that format. So I know that some families are reluctant to fill out scales and questionnaires afterwards in a way that they can't understand, because there's a sense of impatience, and also it's a feeling of, well, why are you asking me this? Because you haven't given me the answers to my questions. I don't know if you can tell that there's a difference I think in the registry, in the family registry, there are questions about description of the patient that include any previous disability or unusual ability. And I think that is something that I can see families wanting to answer. But scales are just different because it's something that people don't always see. And I see there are a couple of other families and patients online. I don't know if they want to comment, because I know that response rates for these surveys have not been that great.
Laura, I think someone else is going to say something. I'll just add, I'm curious if we're talking about using any of these different scales for quality of life, like people have mentioned, and some of the other ones as part of clinical care, if that then helps guide, additional interventions or support or things like that, if that helps with kind of the motivation or wanting to do the scales, compared to if you do them and it doesn't influence your treatment or your clinical care at all. I don't know.
I just wanted to comment, I'm sorry, I'm Jenna Yu from Mount Sinai Hospital. I just wanted to comment on the EEG data. I'm looking at the EEG data from multiple centers that are in this registry, and there's a great variability. And there are sometimes, seizures going on in the EEG, but the EEG stopped. There's a lot of variability on what kind of features you report, and also variability about if they got a ambulatory EEG in the chronic phase. So I think if there is I think HIPAA's the core data element, if we can agree on minimum features that we want to get from the EEG and chronic data, I think that would be great.
Yeah, good point.
We'll just ask for weekly 24-hour EEGs for 2 years.
Hi, I'm Coral Strudney from Boston Children's. Just on a practical comment, so we have a consortia that is enrolling children and young adults with autoimmune encephalitis and Rasmussen. And after a lot of similar debate, we landed on the PEDS QL and QI disability as the two metrics that we're using because it spans the lifespan for PEDS QL, and QI disability will capture patients at varying developmental abilities as well. But nothing is perfect, but it's worked so far for us, but we don't have more data as of yet. And I think if we could use something like that, that's 1 or 2 pages for patient and caregiver reported outcomes, as well as a simple functional scale like the EDSS and multiple sclerosis, or there's similar scores for other diseases, would be helpful to include in each clinic visit as well, that can very easily be extracted for research purposes later. And the sooner that we decide and can standardize, that could be hugely helpful, I think.
Yeah.
Good point. Can you just explain the grant you submitted and what it has to do with Norse again? I meant to mention it earlier, but I forgot.
Oh, yes. So we submitted another NIH grant that includes Norse, autoimmune encephalitis, and Rasmussen syndrome to enroll them within this similar infrastructure that Larry and the team has at Yale with these other diseases through a rare disease cohort. So we'll find out about that at a similar time in like March, as well, similar to the time that Bacoria is coming back.
While we're bringing the mic over to Danielle, I'm just going to mention that Sandy online had mentioned that for her, it would be really hard, or she wouldn't be able to fill out a scale because the functioning varies day to day, sometimes even moment to moment. So I had done some interviews with families, and that was a big thing that came up in interviews of families, is just the variability over time, which really makes things hard as well when you're asking about a 7-day, look back. That may be very different from time to time. And so that's a challenge as well. Thank you, Sandy.
I was wondering, to Nora's point and to some of the issues with the scales, if maybe we did something where we did like an AI approach where, family members could write their narrative and we could do kind of like an AI machine learning kind of thing. And in that way incorporate and recognize the burden that they're dealing with in terms of scales, and see if that can help us in addition probably to scales, right? Because we do need something standardized. I don't know much about AI in terms of how to manage that, but if there was some way we could do machine learning, like a chat GPT, if you will, if that would be helpful for the families to also incorporate kind of what they're dealing with.
Yeah. I will say we did interviews with several families and some adult patients with Norse and Fires. And so we do have qualitative interview data.
Sorry. Hi. I wanted to comment on that because we did this for sleep problems in a big cohort of DEEs, over 1,200 patients, all DEEs included. And it's amazing how potent it is to determine very specific features of sleep problems. So it is very focused. It was on sleep, and we did a non-directed, they had the right to write till 2 pages, whatever they want about how their child was sleeping without any directive. And we were able really to take out the patterns that are very interesting and that can adjust the classical scores of sleep that are or quantitative or qualitative or whatever. So I think this is something amazingly interesting.
Yeah, it's a great idea. All right. I don't think we have anything else. Yeah, I think if anyone has anything else to share, let me know. This is similar to talking about the definitions, ongoing discussions about how to come up with what the outcome should be and move things forward. But I appreciate everyone's input. Oops.
Great, thanks. So before we break for our social 20 minutes, not hour, I just want to see if anybody has any other things they want to talk about or let us know about what's going on in your places. There's a lot of people from other countries and doing some great stuff. So anybody wants to give us updates or just questions in general that aren't even on the agenda, we have like 10 minutes for more discussion. Yeah, maybe.
I take the opportunity that Vincent is here, Vincent Navarro. Coucou Vincent. And and Aurélie is here to say that we have established in France. So I'm sorry, it's for French speaking group, but mainly for the reference center in France, a multidisciplinary and a discussion about cases of fires and Norse. This, we have it with other autoimmune encephalitis, acute cases, and we have this discussion once a month. And I was thinking about the discussion that Eyal is, I don't know if he is here anyway, if there will be some cases that will be worthy to discuss more with the international group, if not only because of definitely the acute situations, but if we have some lessons to learn, some discussions that are more about the interleukins level, stuff like that. So I'm saying this with Vincent and Aurélie that are here because I think it might be interesting. And we have great discussions and very interesting cases. So for the French-speaking people, if they would like to join, we are happy to have them.
Great. I see Marios is on. You want to make any comments about that or remind
Yeah.
everyone about what you're doing?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we started from September. It's an initiative from Texas, Houston, Baylor College, Eyal and the team there. Jean Yitzen, who is there as well, and also Kirsten Fisher and other colleagues from here and from Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we started this monthly meeting for acute clinical cases. You had been invited as well, Rima and the team, and I think Aurélie and Vincent came also to one of the meetings. But we're very keen in a way, if we can join forces somehow. I don't know if we could combine, somehow and join forces, and maybe the fires Norse cases could be discussed separately, but I don't know if that can be something that you could consider. Maybe we can take it out of the meeting and see if we can find a way of how we could combine this. And a separate comment that I put there, because I was hoping that at some point we would discuss actually the length of status, and I put a comment there because of course I've seen your pediatric fires cases and the percentage of epilepsy and all this, and I've heard also Andreas's comment. I mean, it's something like 30% of seizure freedom after 1 year, something I've never seen in all the cases I've been involved in, and I've been involved about 25 cases either directly or indirectly. So I think what worries me is that many people lump fires or name fires based probably on the definition and how loose the definition is, especially in terms of time, that probably wouldn't have named fires in other settings or centers or countries. So I'm a bit worried that this may muddy the waters actually when we're looking for the holy grail, which is cryptogenic fires.
Thank you. I know there's a couple other people who are just starting some funded studies related to Norse, like Vincent, you want to tell us about what you and Aurélie are doing, or and then maybe Stefano and you guys tell us about your project, the biomarker stuff. Let's start with Vincent.
Yes. So we obtained this award from the Cure Foundation in order to have a look to the more chronic phase of Norse patients. So with Aurélie Hanin, we are doing some dosage of cytokine in patients with in a chronic phase of Norse and fires. So we are still recruiting patients, and we want to have some new findings in order to have an idea of the persistence or not of inflammatory markers in that patient. And also we want to identify some marker in order to prognostic the fact that the patient will or not develop epilepsy. So I think that it is really important to clearly define well this chronic phase of the patient in order to identify subgroup with epilepsy or with recurrent status in order to improve that kind of analysis. So Aurélie, if you want to add something.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so as say Vincent, we are still recruiting. So the goal was to have like 40 patients by the end of March. And for now we have 31, so we are open to any enrollment. So you can contact us either like on the French address for those who have it, or just on norse@yale.edu. We also receive patients there. No IRB is needed because it's a new biorepository shared with Yale. And so what else? Yeah, we also compare those patients to patients with chronic autoimmune diseases, like patient with GAD65 encephalitis, HU, also Rasmussen, in order to see if we may have like similar profile during the chronic phase.
Thank you. Stefano, you want?
Stefano Meleti, Modena, Italy. Yeah. Yes, now we have a project to study biomarker of neuronal damage like neurofilament, light chain, or inflammation like S100B protein in Norse patient in the acute phase. And we take advantage since in our center, in our laboratory, we already have tested such biomarker in patients with status epilepticus of different etiology, and also in a group of patients with the cryptogenic status or new onset status. And so the idea is to try to investigate specific, the type and entity of neuronal damage in blood and CSF in patients with Norse during the acute phases. So this is the idea. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. So that's just 3 examples where people are using our biobank to do some great research. So
yeah,
for Jenna with the EEGs, it was just getting data. For this, it's sharing biosamples. So thank you for letting me use you as an example of a great way to use the biobank. So other people have projects they want to do or data you want to look at it, let us know. Any last comments before we just open it up for socializing and eating some more, assuming the food is still out there? I don't think there's any other announcements I forgot. Oh yeah, we have 2 more. Yeah, go ahead. 2 comments.
I wanted to ask, the cytokines are collected from blood or CSF?
Blood and CSF, when we can get them, yeah.
And the CSF should be frozen in -70 and sent in this kind of temperature, or should be?
Matthew, can you give her a mic?
Just before I'm ending, maybe you should add neurocaring to the CSF models. Follow the chronic phase to see if there is. One of the things to measure with the cytokines is neopterin level, because I think it's a very good marker for inflammation, and it can be measured in the acute phase. And when we measured it in acute phase, it was always very high. But maybe if you have a chance to measure it later, and you can check it in the blood too, you can see how long the inflammation is kind of lagging after the kind of recovery of the patient.
So yeah, for the CSF, we just request to have the CSF and the serum, that's the same thing, within 2 hours. So after collection, and you can alicot as supernatant and store it like frozen. Minus 80, it's better. If it's just like for a few days before shipping to Yale, it can be at minus 20. And regarding neopterin, yes, we are trying actually to measure this marker. For now, I just tried like multiple ELISA kits and it's not working. So we are trying to be in contact with other teams who measure neopterin without ELISA kits to see how they do, because like the commercial kits are not very good for this analyte.
Andreas, you.
We have a very good long-term working outcome group led by Krista, and my hope is that we have also acute phase outcome working group. So because I think it's important to got from the bench side to the bed. We have an encephalopathy, then seizures, and not only seizures, and but many seizures, and less inflammation, more excitation, and I don't know which role the cytokines have, and we have over weeks this excitation, and after the acute phase we have without latent period. This differs from post-stroke or post-trauma or post-infection epilepsy seizures going on. And so I think it's very important to think about how can cytokines build up a process that continue over weeks, and so this is for me very important to go over the cytokines measurement is very important. I think so, but we must discuss how it fits together.
Including with the chronic imaging findings that show progressive atrophy over months and years, which I think someone needs to explain, at least to me. Okay, thank you, everyone. We've entered our social phase. All right, we'll say goodbye to everybody on Zoom. Thanks for joining.